Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into a stack of sources about, well, maybe the most famous chess opening, and definitely one of the most complex, the Sicilian defense.
It really is something else. So much history, so much theory.
Yeah, exactly. We've gathered quite a bit here, insights from the starting out, the
Oh,
Sicilian book, some tactical breakdowns from places like Chessify and Simplify Chess,
good resources.
and even a Reddit thread that really captures how players feel about just the sheer size of it all.
Oh yeah, the feeling of being overwhelmed is pretty common with the Sicilian.
Right. So our mission, for this deep dive, we want to try and cut through that huge amount of info, pull out the really important ideas, the main strategies.
Get the big picture.
Exactly. Give you a solid framework, basically. Understand why it's so popular, but also why it feels so, well, daunting sometimes. Like getting the Cliff's Notes without getting lost in every single move variation. Okay, let's unpack this.
So, okay, the Sicilian. It all starts with Black's very first move, doesn't it?
Yeah.
White plays 1 point e4, the most common start, and instead of just mirroring with 1 point e5, Black goes 1 point c5.
And that one move, 1.c5, it changes everything right away. What's the core idea there?
Well, fundamentally, Black is immediately staking a claim on the d4 squared, about central control, but from the flank.
Okay.
By putting that pawn on c5, Black's basically saying, if you, White, push your pawn to d4 to occupy the center,
Which white often wants to do.
exactly, then I'm ready to trade my c-pawn for your d-pawn, cxd4. And that trade usually helps Black by getting rid of one of White's central pawns.
So it's an immediate fight for the center, just asymmetrical.
Precisely. That asymmetry is the key characteristic right from move one. Like the starting out book points out, it's not like 1 point e4, e5, where things are balanced, mirrored.
Right.
This imbalance, it just leads to dynamic, unbalanced positions almost immediately. Both sides often have chances to play for a win right out of the gate. It makes it harder for White to just coast to a small, safe advantage.
That makes sense. But that asymmetry, it also leads to, well, a lot of complexity. That Reddit post you mentioned earlier, the title was something like, Every Variation of the Sicilian Defense.
Yeah, that one. And the comments were revealing, you saw the jokes, right? People listing things like the hyper-accelerated pterodactyls.
Holes, I saw that, and Dragon D's nuts.
Right. And the Swift cheese, the Bon Cloud Sicilian. It just highlights how vast and maybe a little absurd the sheer volume of theory feels to players.
It's almost a meme in itself.
Kind of, yeah. But looking at it seriously, the official eco codes, the Encyclopedia of Chess Openings, it uses B20 all the way through B99 just for the Sicilian.
B20 to B99, that's 80 codes.
80 different codes,
Wow.
more than any other opening. Now, okay, they group similar variations like B70, B79 is the dragon, B90, B99 is the Najdorf, but still, needing 80 categories, it tells you something of the branching possibilities.
No wonder people in that thread felt overwhelmed. Comments like, I'm lost. Where do I even start as a beginner? Or just, every move feels like theory.
Yeah, and that COVID ancestry tree comparison.
That really resonated. It paints a picture of this endlessly branching, complex thing.
It does. It's easy to feel like you'd need a lifetime just to learn the basics.
Okay, so let's try not to map the entire ancestry tree. Let's zoom out. Most games tend to go into what's called the open Sicilian, right? That's after White does play 3-point d4.
Correct. White decides to directly challenge Black's setup with 3-point d4. Black usually plays 3-ton cxd4, and White recaptures, typically with the knight, 4-point nxd4. That exchange defines the open Sicilian.
And this leads to sharper games, generally.
Yeah, very often. Because lines start to open up, pieces get developed quickly, and the fight over key squares like d5 becomes really intense. It leads to dynamic, tactical positions.
So the starting out book and other sources, they focus on the main variations within this open Sicilian landscape.
Exactly. Understanding the big ones like the dragon, the Najdorf, the Scheveningen, and the Sveshnikov gives you a handle on the main types of strategic battles you'll encounter.
Okay, let's start with one of the most famous names, the dragon. That's 1-point e4 c5, 2-point nf3 d6, 3-point d4 cx d4, 4-point nx d4, nf6, 5-5 nt3 g6. That last move, g6.
That's the defining move. 5-point g6 signals the dragon. Black's plan is to put the dark squared bishop on g7, fianchettoing it.
Right, the fianchetto.
And that bishop on g7, it stares down that long a1 h8 diagonal. It can become incredibly powerful, especially, like Simplified Chess points out, if the center opens up. Black wants to use it to pressure White's center and queenside.
Okay, so Black gets this powerful bishop. How does white typically respond? Sounds like you need an aggressive plan.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
The most famous, the most theoretically heavy response is the Yugoslav attack. White usually plays 6b3, then prepares to put the queen on d2, castle queenside, 0-0-0.
So setting up the battery on the h-file.
Exactly. And then launch a direct pawn storm against black's kingside, usually h4, h5, trying to break open the h-file for the rook, maybe followed by g4, g5. It's a race. Yeah, because black isn't passive. While white attacks on the king side, black, who usually castles kingside in the dragon, counterattacks on the queen side, pushing pawns like Tod a6, body v5, using the rook on the semi-open c-file with dot rc8.
So it's kingside attack versus queenside counterplay. Sounds sharp.
Extremely sharp. Starting out really emphasizes this one wrong move, one inaccuracy, and the game can be over very quickly for either side. It's high-stakes chess.
Wow. Are there less crazy ways for white to play against the dragon?
Oh, sure. There's the classical variation starting with 6b2. White develops more traditionally, usually castles kingside. The game becomes less about immediate attack and more about strategic maneuvering. White might still probe the king side, but it's generally less volatile.
Okay.
And there are other tries, too, like the Levenfish attack, 6 pawn f4, which immediately challenges the whole g7 bishop idea, or more positional approaches like fianchetto and the white bishop with 6g3. But the Yugoslav is really considered the main test.
Got it. So dragon, g6 fianchetto, often leads to Yugoslav attack, opposite side castling, race to attack, or quieter classical lines. Now, what about the Najdorf? 1 point e4 c5, 2 point nf or d6, 3 point d4 cx d4, 4 point nx d4, nf6, 5 point nc3 a6. That little 5 point a6 move. What's the big deal?
5 point a6. It looks small, but it's hugely important strategically. As starting out explains, its primary function is to take the by5 square away from white's pieces.
Like stopping a bishop check or a knight hop.
Exactly. Prevents bb5 plus or mb5. But it also prepares black's own expansion on the queen side, typically with a later point b5 push.
Okay, so it's preventative and preparatory.
Right. And the Najdorf is known for being incredibly flexible. Black keeps options open for different pawn structures later on. It's considered very ambitious, but you really need to understand the subtle positional points and be ready for sharp tactics. Control over the d5 square is, again, absolutely critical.
How does white typically try to fight against the Najdorf? Similar attacking ideas.
Sometimes, yes. The English attack, starting with 6b3, is very popular these days. It often follows a similar pattern to the Yugoslav against the dragon. Queen to d2, castle queenside, launch a kingside pawn storm with g4, g5.
So another race.
Often, yes. Black frequently plays an early by h6 in response, trying to slow down that g4, g5 push. It leads to very complex, double-edged battles.
What about the older main lines?
Well, the traditional main line is 6 point bg5. This pins the knight on f6 and leads to incredibly deep theory. This is the home of the famous poison pawn variation.
Ah, the poison pawn, Fischer, Kasparov.
Right, where black bravely snatches a pawn on b2 with the queen, often sacrificing material or king safety for immense activity and counter chances. It really shows the dynamic potential black is seeking in the Najdorf.
So very sharp. Any quieter options for white here too?
Yes. Just like in the dragon, there's a classical setup with 6b2, leading to kingside castling and more strategic play. And there are other aggressive tries, like the Fischer attack with 6bc4, putting immediate pressure on black's central intentions. You have to watch out for tricks involving sacrifices on e6 in that line.
Okay, so Najdorf. 5 point a6 stops bait b5, prepares point b5, very flexible, battle for d5. Often met by the English attack, similar to Yugoslav, or the super theoretical 6 point bg5 lines, or calmer classical setups.
Got it. What about some other big open Sicilians? Starting out, mentioned a few more.
Right, let's touch on them. There's the Scheveningen. You often reach this with 1 point e4 c5, 2 point nf3 d6, 3 point e4 cx d4, 4 point nx d4, nf6 5 na6 pawns, but small center.
Exactly. That d6 e6 pawn structure is the hallmark.
Like,
Black aims for a solid setup and often hopes to achieve the central pawn break point d6 d5 later on, which frees the position. White can play various systems against it, including, again, the English attack or classical setups.
seems like those white attacking plans are pretty common themes.
They are recurring ideas, yes. How to best generate winning chances against black's solid structures. Then you have this Sveshnikov, which is quite different. 1 point e4 c5, 2 point nf3 nc6, 3 point d4 cx 4 point nfc4 nf5 2 nc3 e5.
Whoa, point e5 so early. Kicking the knight.
Immediately challenging that knight on d4. There's a very concrete, very theoretical line. White usually responds 6 point mb5, attacking d6, and black defends with 6 d6. The whole game then revolves around control of the key d5 square, which becomes a strategic outpost for white or a target for black. Very dynamic. Lots of theory.
Okay, that sounds sharp too. And one more. The accelerated dragon.
Ah, yes, the accelerated dragon. 1 point e4 c5, 2 point n3 nc6, 3 point d4 c at d4, 4 point ngsd4 g6.
So G6 again, but after NC6 instead of D6. What's the difference?
The move order difference is subtle but important. By playing that g6 earlier, black sometimes hopes to play the pot d7, d5 pawn break in one go, saving a tempo compared to the mainline dragon, where it's often point d6 first, then later point d5.
Saving the tempo sounds good. Is there a catch?
There is. White has a very specific and effective way to combat this idea from Rossi bind. White plays 5 point c4.
C4. So white doesn't allow the quick pot D5.
Exactly. By playing c4 alongside e4, white creates this pawn clamp in the center, controlling the key d5 and by5 squares. It really restricts black's central pawn breaks, point d5 or point b5. The Maroczy bind leads to fundamentally different positions, more positional, less tactical fireworks usually. Black has to maneuver carefully to find counterplay against white's space advantage.
Okay, the Maroczy bind. That sounds like a key strategic concept against the accelerated dragon then. Restrictive, positional.
Very much so. It's a major reason why the accelerated dragon, while viable, faces this unique strategic challenge.
All right, so that covers the big open Sicilians where white plays 3-point d4. But as we said, white doesn't have to do that, right? They can sidestep all this deep theory.
Absolutely. There are several important anti-Sicilians systems where white chooses a different path on move 2 or 3, specifically to avoid the main lines of the open Sicilian.
What are the main ones?
Well, a very popular group of the BB5 systems. This includes the Rossolimo variation. After 1 point e4 c5, 2 point nf3 nc6, white plays 3 point bb5, and the Moscow variation. After 1 point e4 c5, 2 point nf3 d6, white plays 3 point bb5 plus.
So developing the bishop early to b5 instead of playing d4.
Exactly. Instead of the immediate central confrontation, white puts pressure on black's knight on c6 in the Rossolimo, or just develops the bishop actively with a check in the Moscow. These lines are often seen as a practical choice to get quieter, more strategic games, avoiding the mountains of theory in the Najdorf or Dragon.
So more positional, less memorization required, maybe?
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
White might aim to exchange the bishop for the knight, changing the pawn structure, and then maybe build up in the center later with moves like c3 and d4.
Okay, what else?
There's the c3 Sicilian, where white plays 2 point c3. The idea is very straightforward. White wants to follow up with d4 and establish a strong classical pawn center.
Simple plan. How does black respond?
Black has choices. They can challenge the center immediately with moves like 2 point nf6 or 2 point d5, leading to sharper play, or sometimes allow white to build the center and try to undermine it later. It's generally considered less theoretical than the open Sicilian, though some lines can get sharp.
Right. And I remember you mentioned a trap. The Siberian trap, does that come up here?
You can,
Yeah.
yes. In certain lines stemming from the c3 Sicilian or some that's the related Mora gambit, you can get this nasty tactic after moves like bc4, qc7, oo, nf6, qe2, black plays ng4. If white carelessly plays h3, thinking they're just kicking the knight,
Oh.
black has nd4, attacking the queen and threatening mate on f2. White loses the queen. It's a good reminder that even in these quieter sidelines, tactical alertness is crucial.
Good lesson. Any other major anti-Sicilians?
Well, there are others, like the closed Sicilian, usually starting 2 bot nc3, where white aims for a slower build-up, often keeping the center closed, maybe preparing a kingside attack later, and flank openings like the Grand Prix attack, often involving 2 pawn nc3 and 3 point f4, and as mentioned, gambits like the Mora gambit, 1 point e4 c5, 2 point d4 cxd4, 3 point c3, where white sacrifices a pawn right away for quick development and attacking chances.
So lots of ways for white to try and set the tone and avoid the deepest theoretical jungles.
Definitely. It gives white options depending on their style and preparation level.
Wow. Okay, so we've gone through the core idea, the sheer scale of it all, the main open Sicilian battlegrounds, Dragon, Najdorf, Scheveningen, Sveshnikov, accelerated Dragon Maroczy bind, and now these anti-Sicilians. It really is a universe unto itself.
It is, and it's totally understandable why players, especially beginners or intermediate players, feel that sense of being overwhelmed we talked about from that Reddit thread.
Yeah, where do you even begin?
But here's the thing, and this is important perspective. Your opponents, unless you're playing Grandmasters, probably don't know all that theory either. They might know their specific line a bit, but not everything.
So memorizing thousands of lines isn't necessarily the answer.
Not for most players.
Yeah.
What is incredibly valuable, and hopefully what this deep dive helps with, is understanding the core strategic ideas, the why behind the moves.
Like the themes we've discussed.
Exactly. Understanding black's goals with 1 point c5, the importance of the d5 square, the typical kingside versus queenside fights, the power of that fianchettoed bishop in the dragon. the purpose of pawn a6 in the Narsdorf,
Yeah.
the restrictive idea of the Marassi bind, the positional aims of the BV5 systems.
Knowing the story of each variation, not just the moves.
Precisely. Knowing the typical plans, the strategic goals, the common pawn structures and breaks that helps you navigate the positions much more effectively, even when you're out of book, than just rote memorization ever could. This dive gives you that map, those key landmarks.
That makes a lot of sense. It feels more manageable thinking about it that way. Less like memorizing a phone book, more like learning the layout of a city. We've toured the Dragon District, the Najdorf neighborhood, seen the Scheveningen structures, felt the Marazzi squeeze, and visited the anti-Sicilian suburbs.
Chuckles. That's a good way to put it.
It's just so clear why the Sicilian is so enduringly popular and why it sparks so much study and debate. Hopefully, this deep dive, pulling from the book, the sites, the player experiences, has given everyone listening some valuable context and those key strategic takeaways.
And what's still amazing, I think, is that even with decades of analysis, powerful engines, huge databases, people are still finding new ideas in the Sicilian.
Really? Even now?
Oh, yeah. Novelties pop up, strategic reassessments happen. It's a living opening. The theoretical frontier keeps moving.
So the big question then, maybe, what does mastering, or at least navigating the Sicilian really mean? Is it an endless memory challenge? Or is it more about deeply understanding those strategic battle lines, the typical piece maneuvers, and being ready for those sharp, unbalanced fights?
That's probably the million-dollar question.
Right.
Likely a bit of both, but understanding probably takes you further.
Definitely something to think about next time you're facing 1.e4 or playing 1.c5 yourself.
Indeed.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.